My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event in collaboration with the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies. It's the second, in just a couple of months, event that we've done working with Pardes, and we're very happy to do so. Before I ask our speakers to join us, and Deborah and Standing from Pardes, I'll just say a few words for those of you maybe new to the Begin Center or maybe unsure as to the connection for this event between the Begin Center and Pardes. I want to also dispel rumors that it was just an excuse for me to bring two British people onto the stage, which I've been accused of before. We hold regular events here in English at the Begin Center, both in person here at the Merkaz, here at the center, and also on Zoom webinars. We have a mailing list for English-speaking events, and if you're not on that mailing list and would like to be, then drop me an email, paulg@begincenter.org.il, or you can also find it on the website or our Facebook page. Menachem Begin, this is obviously not an event that we're going to talk a lot about Menachem Begin, but I will just say that the collaboration with an institute that deals with Torah and Jewish text and Jewish tradition, I think is very fitting for this center, because Menachem Begin was, as some of you may know, the first Israeli prime minister who really saw himself first and foremost as a Jew. He was Israeli by nationality, by citizenship, but his primary identity was as a Jew. And you'll see and notice in many of his speeches and writings sort of littered with biblical allusions and references. And that was sort of common throughout his time in office. Now it's sort of customary for prime ministers, once they win an election, to go to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, to give thanks for their great success. That didn't happen until Menachem Begin. Prime ministers prior to him, for prime ministers prior to him, that would have been a very odd thing to do indeed. But he was, as I said, Jewish first and foremost. So I think the collaboration with an institute that does so much to bring Torah and Jewish text to Jerusalem is very natural from my perspective. I also want to say, just on the topic of this event and the books that we're going to hear about, Menachem Begin was someone who thought that disagreement was not just something to be tolerated, but actually something to be welcomed. Especially in the world of politics, he very much saw the freedom to disagree as absolutely fundamental to democracy. Some of you will know that he was in opposition for many, many years before eventually being elected prime minister. And he once said that without an opposition that can and will disagree with the government of the day, then the country cannot truly be free. So I think in that spirit, I'm very happy to have an event where we're talking about the need for civil debate and disagreement. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Deborah and Standing, the Educational Director of Engagement for Pardes.
Good evening. My name is Deborah Ann Standing. I am a Detroiter, not from England. I am a millennial, a Jewish educator, and a recently ordained rabbi from Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. And I made Aliyah this past summer. It's not about me, but this is just a little background. I now serve as Pardes' Educational Director of Engagement, which means it's my job to both teach here and go back and forth to North America, meeting students who might spend time in our immersive programs in Jerusalem. If you know somebody who wants to spend a summer or a semester or a year, please send them my way. It is my great privilege to welcome you to this special event this evening. We'll soon have the privilege of listening in on a 5 decades-long chavruta between our two authors, Ambassador Daniel Taub and Rabbi Michael Marmur, on recently published joyful, thought-provoking, and inspiring books, Beyond Dispute and Living the Letters, an Alphabet of Emerging Jewish Thought, here at the Begin Center in partnership with us at Pardes. The emergence of these books at this moment could not be more essential as our communities continue to face pressing moments internally and beyond, both here in Israel and throughout the diaspora. When we're not facing external threats, we encounter ruptures and fractures that have the potential to leave us feeling distant and removed from one another. Ambassador Taub's and Rabbi Marmur's books are manifestations of the type of reflection, innovation, and hope that is essential to build Jewish lives. Their books affirm what we believe at Pardes, that safeguarding Jewish identity and for Jewish identity to matter requires teaching people to find wells of Torah, where Torah inspires joy, creativity, and confidence to experiment, wonder, and even disagree. And that's what these books are. They are wells of nourishment, providing us guiding tools for this moment. Each of us would benefit from attending on how to behave as soon as we hear a position that we agree with. Each of us should feel invited to draw from our tradition to create playful, chunky, to borrow from Rabbi Marmur's book, and honest philosophies of our own. That's what we do at Pardes, and that's what we're doing tonight here at the Begin Center as our extended Beit Midrash. May this chavruta between Ambassador Taub and Rabbi Marmur inspire each of us to lead even more vibrant, meaningful, and interconnected Jewish lives. Who are these people? Ambassador Daniel Taub is a diplomat and international lawyer. He served as a member of Israel's negotiation teams in the Israeli-Syrian and Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and as Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, from which he came. He also served as director of strategy and planning of the Yad HaNadiv Rothschild Foundation. Daniel is the author of Parasha Diplomatit, a book of diplomatic insights on biblical texts, and created a popular Israeli drama series called Hechatzer, set in an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic sect. We should all find this too. He has taught classes at Pardes and run difficult conversations laboratories using rabbinic insights to deepen discussions of contentious issues. Daniel was educated at University College Oxford, University College London, and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He also studied at Pardes in 1985, 1986, and he lives here in Yerushalayim with his wife Zahava, and they have 6 children. Rabbi Michael Marmur is the Associate Professor of Jewish Theology at HUC, Hebrew Union College here in Jerusalem. He served as the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Provost at Hebrew Union College, having previously been Dean of the Jerusalem campus. After some 20 years in different administrative roles, he now concentrates on teaching and writing. Also a British man, Rabbi Marmur completed his undergraduate degree in modern history at Oxford before moving here to Israel in 1984. While studying for a master's degree in ancient Jewish history at Hebrew University here, he completed his studies also in the Israeli rabbinical program of HUC. And before coming back here, he served as rabbi and teacher at Leobek in Haifa. Rabbi Marmur served for 3 years as the chair of the Board of Rabbis for Human Rights and still remains a member of the board. He has lectured and taught widely throughout the world. He is married to Sarah, and they have 3 adult children. It is my pleasure to invite them both to the stage. The format will be, they'll be in conversation for about 45 minutes, followed by an opportunity for questions and answers. Bivakasha.
So Rabbi Deborah, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Paul and the Begin Center, thank you for this wonderful hospitality. And a heartfelt thanks from us to Rabbi Leon Morris and to Pardes for this evening and for everything that you're doing for Jewish education in the Jewish world today. It's an incredibly moving thing for me to be sitting here next to Michael. You said 5 decades, and it really is, which is somewhat scary. Some 50 years ago, Michael and I were in school together, and the non-Jewish kids in our school, that's the majority, simply could not understand why the 2 most Jewish kids in the year were constantly arguing with each other. Michael, himself a budding theologian and the son of a very leading Reform rabbi, me coming from an Orthodox background, and our non-Jewish classmates were learning more about ongoing revelation and biblical criticism than they ever thought that they were going to. And then somebody had a stroke of genius and said, why don't we put those 2 boys in the school debating team? And since that, after that, we were the school debating team. And we had a fair amount of success, but more importantly, through arguing, we became friends. And we're friends throughout university, where we lived in the same house, and have been friends ever since. And in a strange way, this past year, both of us published books, which in a way draw from our experiences over those decades and try and use those experiences as some kind of bridge between our Jewish identity and the modern reality. So that is our subject for Chavruta this evening, and I have the absolute pleasure of asking Michael about this extraordinarily beautiful book, Living the Letters. It's beautiful in its conception. It's beautiful in its tone. And I won't presume to summarize what it's about, but what I'll do is ask Michael to say, what was it that led you to write this book, and what do you hope people will take away from it?
Let me just reiterate the great pleasure, the joy of being able to do this in this perfectly natural environment for a conversation between 2 old friends in a large echoey hall with an audience. It's just how we always do it. In fact, reflecting on the title of Daniel's book, I'm not sure, I mean, we have had some constructive disagreement, but I think of the last 50 years mainly as a good deal of unconstructive agreement, which we've managed to enjoy with each other over the years. My book is 4 things. It is a synthesis. It is a checklist. It is a cri de coeur, a cry of the heart, and it is an invitation. It's a synthesis of a great deal of reading and thinking and some writing that I've been doing over the last several decades, and attempts to bring them together in a certain kind of, some of that reading and thinking into a kind of a format. It's a checklist, if you like, or a litany, or I'm not quite sure the best way to describe it, because it offers, using a traditional Jewish structure of the Hebrew alphabet, it offers, after a long and apparently impenetrable introduction, there then are 22 short chapters. They're also impenetrable, but they're shorter. And each of them is on a theme. The theme is denoted by a word in Hebrew, which begins in order with one of the letters of the Hebrew language. So it's, if you like, a lexicon. It's a synthesis, it's a lexicon, it's a cry of the heart, because it includes a number of the issues that I find to be most painful and most urgent. I write in the introduction that I make a bold claim that Jewish theologies, maybe throughout our history, are always written from a combination of anxiety and hope. And that if you don't have the anxiety, you're not going to spend all this time trying to work it through. But if you don't have hope, you'll be paralyzed and also won't write the thing. Fourthly, it's an invitation. As I say at the end of the book, you can close your ears if you don't want to hear any spoilers of what happens at the end of the book. But I do say to my readers, whoever's made it that far, that this is my attempt to set out my lexicon, my alphabet. But what I'm most interested in is what each of my readers might consider to be their own. And if it operates on those levels as a synthesis, as a lexicon, as a cri de coeur, and as an invitation, then it will have achieved something. Having given you that answer to your question, it's my turn to say that this book, which...
Before you do that, I just want to push back a little bit. First of all, to insist that your book is really far from impenetrable. And for a book on theology, it has more humor and more practical insight than you would ever expect. But I do want to ask you just to say a word, to give a little flavor, because Rabbi Deborah hinted at it. Just say a word about peanut butter and the relationship between peanut butter and your book.
I was waiting for the sponsorship deal with Skippy to come through. I make the claim that speaks to the structure of the book and the lexicon aspect. I make a claim in the introduction that one way, an original way of thinking about Jewish theologies, which itself is a very contested term, is to make the distinction between smooth and crunchy, or smooth and chunky. Between the chunky and crunchy, those are local differences of opinion. Smooth theology spreads thin and evenly and reaches every space. If you read it, I can point out some examples over the last 1,000 years. The intent of the author is to give you the answers you might be looking for to all the big questions. I say that that's not theology I'm capable of or interested in writing. So instead, what you have is a chunky theology, the bits of which may get stuck in your teeth or who knows where else, but it's got chunks of texts, of sources, of traditions, of ideas, and it doesn't read, it's not meant to read as one beautiful, synthetic, harmonious whole. So that's where the peanut butter comes into it. Let me say, since you started by saying very beautiful things about my book, that this book does a remarkable thing by introducing different worlds of expertise and discourse, the worlds of diplomacy and negotiation on the one hand, if you like, and a profound reading of Jewish tradition, most particularly rabbinic thought systems and structures on the other. And just as I tried in a couple of minutes to sort of outline what I think my book is, now it's your turn.
Thank you. So in a way, the idea for the book came from a strange little experience. I volunteer as a mediator in a community mediation center. And one time I was mediating a dispute between two Arab residents of Jerusalem, and it was becoming very heated. And I have a co-mediator, and on this occasion, he was an Arab sheikh. And he said to me, "Do you mind if I depart from the mediation protocol?" I said, "There's nothing to lose here, go ahead." And so he stopped speaking in Hebrew, he started speaking in Arabic. And more to the point, he stopped speaking as a mediator, and he started speaking as an imam, as a religious leader. And something extraordinary happened in the room. The entire dynamic changed. He was channeling a kind of Muslim tradition of sulha, of reconciliation, and it was extraordinarily powerful. And it made me realize that, we tend to think that our tribal traditions can almost only pull us apart. But maybe if we look at them in the right way, they may have the seeds of things that can bring us together. And so I started thinking about what our tradition of argument might have that could help us do that, and particularly the rabbinic tradition that began some 2,000 years ago. And the thing that was so surprising to me was how many similarities there were between the rabbinic insights and modern social psychology and conflict management theory. And the penny that dropped for me was that this rabbinic approach to argument, which is very different from the biblical approach, really developed as a response to a terrible social crisis 2,000 years ago with the destruction of the temple and the exile. And that crisis reflected itself in terms of lack of trust in truth and information, lack of trust in authority, retreats into echo chambers and tribalism. So basically a social crisis that is very similar to the social crisis that many Western societies are facing today. So the book is really an attempt to dig down into what are the principles and the practices that gave a rise and to try and test them against the situation today. And I think what I would hope that people might take away from it, apart from some practical tools, if you go online to Amazon and look for a book about argument, you'll tend to find books that fall into one of two categories. The larger group have titles like Win Every Argument and are about how you leave your opponent lying in a quivering heap on the floor. And the others, a smaller group, have titles like How to Have an Argument-Free Marriage and how to avoid it at all costs and go back to drinking tea while there's a sort of lump under the carpet where you've swept it and you hope it's never going to come out again. And I think the Jewish approach recognizes that, in the absence of a sort of biblical truth from on high, truth is something that we're going to need to work out collaboratively. And an argument, when it's done well, when it's for the sake of heaven, is a way both to bring us a little bit closer to the truth and hopefully a little bit closer to each other. So that's a word about the book. And now what we thought we would do is to sort of take turns to gently challenge each other, if we can, in relation to some of the things that we found interesting in each other's books. And it's very difficult to do that with Michael's book, because long before you can challenge him, he's challenged himself. And as he said, his opening chapter sort of puts on the table the anxieties that he brings to bear as he sets off on this expedition. But for all of that, I would like to ask you to dig down a little bit into one of those anxieties. And it's an anxiety that I think lies at the heart of an attempt to marry modernity and modern critical faculties with a Jewish religious sensibility. And you ask the question yourself. You ask, can modern Judaism work? You say, the idea of melding modernity to Judaism, the animating story of my life, may in time come unstuck. I doubt little that the concept of a moderate, reasonable Judaism is right, defensible, plausible, and sound, but I worry that it may not be true, resonant, capable of inducing passionate commitment and teachable. And then a little bit further on, you say, I am concerned that the cold light of reason does not generate enough warmth and passion to give us the energy we will all need to be equal to our challenges. And I think probably one answer to that question is your life, in which you actually are a model of somebody who brings tremendous modern critical faculties, and I don't think anybody can question the depth of your passion. But I am interested in how transmittable that is. And, from a theological point of view, how we marry modernity with passion.
I mean, me too. I'm pleased to say that I find myself agreeing with those quotations quite sincerely. And indeed, the two big anxieties that I put on the table, I break them down and give each of them a bit more space. But indeed, the first one is this big question of the project of modern Judaism, the notion that one can embrace modernity with all of its complexities and challenges, and yet be faithful, a faithful son or daughter of one's Jewish tradition, and not see modernity as an enemy to be held off at the gate, but to invite it in and hopefully not only to be seduced by it, but also to be enriched by it and to grow. And again, as I said in the quotation that you brought, I don't struggle too much with the notion that one or other version of a modern Judaism is defensible, is plausible. I find it quite easy to defend and to plause. That's not my problem. It's much more the question of how educable it is, how inspiring it can be. if I look around, this is not unique to Jews, but let's talk about Jews for a moment. If I look around and see what are the movements in Jewish life which are engendering the most support, I'm not even talking about fanatical support where you need to, call for a psychiatric intervention, but I'm talking about the sort of support one would want to see. I find it rare that those are people who are espousing sensible, well-measured, reasoned, moderate, liberal opinions of the sort to which I am myself so committed. And so, this is a classic dilemma of what it means to be a passionate moderate. And I'm not sure we're doing very well in the task. Looking within our society here in Israel and looking around the world in general, I see in many ways evidence of a kind of collapse of that center. And my response to this is not to throw up my hands, but to ask, since I am confident that being part of this Jewish story, it means being part of, I refer in my book to a fantastic essay by Shimon Ravidovich called The Ever-Dying People, in which he says that this is what we Jews are. Most generations of Jewish history have been convinced that we're going to hell in a handbasket and it's the end of everything and you can just give up. The question is whether one can hold one's nerve enough to find resources from within our tradition and from beyond it, which can help us make sure that the next generation gets to experience the same near-death experience. So I don't know if that altogether it really reiterates your question rather than answers it. I am indeed anxious, so anxious about this that I'm motivated to try and be part of some kind of creative response. It's creative by writing, books of thought, but also by trying to mobilize and organize and educate and be actively involved, not to go gently into the dark night of oblivion. Yeah, you got me. I am struggling with that question, and I suppose I could cheer myself up by thinking that the moment one stops struggling with it, then you're really in trouble. Let me come back to you. Your book is both a practical guide, offers all kinds of very actionable steps, but also offers a kind of conceptual framework to what it means for people across a palpable divide, not a fake disagreement, but a profound one, a real one, where both sides have skin in the game, and when it seems to be, an unbridgeable divide, what one might do in such a situation. But I found myself asking on more than one occasion as I'm reading this book, when does that break down? You and I, to personalize this for a moment, like each other, love each other enough, respect each other's intellect and integrity enough, and are fundamentally, I would say, despite our agreements, we find ourselves in the same world of discourse. Consequently, if we disagree, I will share that one of the things that puzzled people in our high school most was that we were both like the super Jews in the school, but following the reform practice, I would stay away for one day of the festival, and following the Orthodox practice, and I think many of them thought that you were just kidding, because it can't possibly be that you were out Jewing me in that regard. But to go back to the question, what does one do? And of course, often in the most consequential disputes, these are the realities that you may face. How do you deal with an interrogator who doesn't play by any of these rules?
I think that's a critical question. It's a particularly critical question today when canceling, when ruling people out has become such a relevant and contentious issue. If I think about the guidance that we could get from the Jewish tradition, I think it's quite clear that the thrust of that tradition is to call in rather than to call out. to welcome opposing, challenging opinions. In the Talmud, this is stressed to almost ridiculous extremes. There are these almost Monty Python-like stories when a student comes to a rabbi and says, tell me, if somebody has two heads, which one of them should they put tefillin on? And the rabbi responds, that's ridiculous, get out of here, or even better, excommunicate yourself. And literally just at that moment, with perfect timing, somebody rushes in and says, my wife has just had a baby with two heads. Do I need to do one Pidyon Haben ceremony or two? And the lesson is quite clearly, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. But at the same time, stretching the umbrella of receptiveness doesn't mean granting legitimacy to the illegitimate. An American academic once said, you don't want to be so open-minded that your brains fall out. And the way that I think about it is, the rabbis said that there are 70 faces to the Torah, but of course that doesn't mean that there can't be a 71st face or a 72nd face that is actually outside the realm of legitimacy. So how can you tell? So I think one guiding instinct, which is very present in the Talmud, which I think is helpful. If you look through the Talmud, there are a number of instances, not so many, but a number, in which rabbis were thrown out of the Bet Midrash, the house of study. And when you look at those cases, almost always, the reason that they were thrown out was not because of what they said, but because, as you suggested, they didn't buy into the rules of the debate. It wasn't a question of content, it was a question of process. And that suggests to me that maybe we should challenge ourselves to listen to uncomfortable opinions, even deeply uncomfortable opinions, whether it's about global warming or vaccination, until the point when somebody says, there's no evidence that you could bring me that would make me change my mind. Because then you're not in a conversation. There's a saying amongst diplomats sometimes, you can change my opinion, but you can't change my instructions. And if you are effectively talking with somebody who is operating in accordance with a set of instructions, I think that's the point where you should be cutting your losses and investing your personal and intellectual energies elsewhere. Can I come back to you? I loved your first answer, but I want to ask a similar question in a related sphere.
You should keep asking the question until you get the answer you had in mind.
No, but I want to ask it in relation to Israel and relation to Zionism. So you write, again, with tremendous passion, but also tremendous nuance, and I think angst as well, about the state of Zionism. And again, I just want to read a paragraph if I can. One more. And the heading here is a conditional Zionism. Little is to be gained, I'll jump a little bit. I'm a Zionist in the sense that I am moved by the emphasis on agency, responsibility, and creativity that it promises. Other strategies of Jewish response to modernity, such as the attempt to bolster a robust Jewish life in the diaspora, are honorable and laudable, and I wish them only success. My severe doubts about the health of the Zionist project are matched by doubts that these alternatives can offer sufficiently compelling frameworks to bolster a Judaism strong enough to prevail, survive, and flourish. My love for the land, the language, and peoples of Israel is immense. My gratitude to those who act heroically in defense of the three linked miracles, security, creativity, and justice, is unreserved. My Zionism is, nonetheless, conditional. And I should mention that in the book, that conditionality finds expression in a number of different ways. But I think my question really relates to in a sense, to the subtitle of your book, which talks about emerging Jewish thought. Because when I read this, I wonder whether we're not seeing something on the rise, but seeing something on the decline. Whether this may be, you talked about a cri de coeur, but maybe it's one of the last cri de coeurs of passionate progressive Zionism. And I just wondered whether, from where you sit, you saw it differently.
I can't, let me try and answer it this way. The book does not try to paper over what I consider to be an overwhelmingly attested fact, which is that we are now in a deep, deep crisis. And it's like often happens with families and individuals, when you're faced with a crisis, you do everything you can to deny the enormity of the crisis until finally you have to face up to it. So whether this is, in fact, as you were kind of implying in your question, less a cry of the heart and more a heart attack, I don't know, and time will tell. We'll come back to the Begin Center in 50 or 70 years and see how things are playing out. I want to say something about the term conditional Zionism. I take from an interview that Vivian Silver, the late Vivian Silver, who died on the 7th of October, gave a couple of years before her murder. And she expressed something that I wanted to echo in the book when she says, I too am a Zionist. She was considered in many circles to be, you know, beyond the pale in terms of her activism and so forth. From my point of view, she's one of the heroes that I'm referring to in the book. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, but she says, my Zionism is conditional on we Jews being prepared to allow for and even work for the same fundamental notion of self-determination and freedom and self-expression for the other, in this case, the Palestinian other, that we want so urgently to claim for ourselves. And that a Zionism that becomes a zero-sum Zionism, in that sense, an unconditional Zionism, which leaves which considers that it's either us or them. I appreciate that the circumstances of the last couple of years will encourage that view. And I'll express gingerly in the Begin Center the thought that to some degree, our political leaders and masters have a certain interest in engineering such a narrative, according to which it's us or them all the way. And I ultimately believe, even if it takes us many decades to get there, that either it's us and them, or it really is oblivion for all of us. I want to say one more thing about this term conditional, which Vivian Silver did not refer to. Herzl calls one of his books Altneuland. And Altneu from the German is usually understood to mean old and new. But as the legends of the Altneuschule in Prague have it, one way of reading, creatively misreading the title of the Altneuschule is it's Altnai. Altnai because when the time comes and we return to our land and the temple is built, then we won't need to be in Prague anymore with all those dumplings and beer, but we'll be able to get... The notion that even if from that point of view, if you like, even our Judaism is Altnai, that I find myself as close to unconditionally committed as I can be, but it's important for me to keep a conditionality. I'm nervous, I'm anxious about a Judaism or any other kind of philosophy or ideology which loses that sense of a condition that goes with it. I also want to some degree, reiterate my first question, but from a different angle. One of the most beautiful and compelling parts of your book relates to the significance of narrative. An outsider might think about negotiations that narrative is for beginners, and that when you get down to real problem solving, I put out my case, you put out your case, and then, you know, but what you point out so beautifully in the book is that without an awareness of the framework into which all of these facts are placed, the story, the arc of the story that is being told, if you ignore that, progress is almost, you know, it's practically not a good idea, but also I think you make an ethical case for respect. Even the story you told about the man becoming an imam can really best be understood in narrative terms. You change the frame of the conversation and then something may indeed happen. The question I want to ask you relates to these impossible times we're living in, when narrative is weaponized, when my narrative, how dare you contest my narrative, and where I am interested, consciously or unconsciously, in erasing any part of your narrative that makes mine uncomfortable or untenable. This is true actually in intra-Jewish conversations, and it's certainly true as Jews, for example, Israelis and Palestinians try to engage in a clash of narratives. So is your stirring faith in the power of narratives not undermined or blown out of the water by the fact that narrative has become so weaponized?
I think that is such a truly fascinating question. And it's one of those questions where even as you ask it, I hear some cogs spinning in my head in a way that maybe they haven't spun before. The point that I make in the book is that, the Talmud is a very, very unusual book of law because so much of it is actually not law. It actually is narrative. It's agadah, it's stories. And actually even the halacha is told in terms of stories. We're not told if the defendant has an object. We're told if Reuven has a talit or something. So it's turned into a little story as well. But I think the importance is, as you say, the law needs to be placed in a context. And beyond that, stories, particularly personal stories, they are ways of bringing in the breadth, the variety of human experience that any law will miss. If you think about the Tanakh, the narrative of the Tanakh is often this extraordinary critical commentary on the law in the Tanakh. According to the law in the Tanakh, the firstborn should inherit twice. A man can have more than one wife. Read the narrative of the Tanakh, and the leaders are always the second or youngest children. Any man that marries more than one wife, it's not a recipe for a happy home. So there is a really interesting interplay how narrative can temper law. But what your question says to me is that maybe stories also need to be tempered. Maybe it works both ways. Maybe they need to be tethered to some kind of framework that sets the ground rules in which they operate. I have to say, by and large, and I think there is a difference between narrative in terms of an overarching conception that shapes our understanding of the reality and personal stories. And I find personal stories so incredibly powerful, subversive. The historian Lynn Hunt makes a really interesting point, which is the concept of human rights arose about the same time as the rise of the novel, because the novel for the first time enabled people to live the lives of people who had very different circumstances to themselves. George Bernard Shaw once said that Charles Dickens was much more subversive of the social order than Karl Marx, because he could make people feel. And I have to say, I felt that in some way in my own experience. When I was involved in the negotiations, I was pretty much prepared for any talking point or piece of data that the other side of the negotiations would bring up. But I wasn't prepared for their stories, for their personal stories. And afterwards, when I was working for a philanthropic foundation here in Jerusalem, and a friend in East Jerusalem, an Arab resident of East Jerusalem, gave me the manuscript of his novel, of what it was like to grow up as an Arab in East Jerusalem. That touched me in a way in which no amounts of research data would have done. And because it relates to pathos, it moves you to action. I worked with other people to set up a forum of foundations to try and address some of the inequities in East Jerusalem. And I think that would have only happened because of the power of the story. I think one of the things that is really striking about your book is how it refuses to allow Jewish identity to be defined by tragedy, by anti-Semitism, by the Shoah. And I think that's extraordinarily powerful considering your personal background. You have a father who came from wartime Ukraine, Siberia, a mother who was in ghettos and in camps. You have, I don't know if you want to tell it, an extraordinarily moving story in the book about your mum making talitot. And yet maybe it does. I wanted to ask you about where you draw the positivity and the strength to be forward-looking and hopeful. And I wanted to ask the question with a quote from your father's book.
Yeah, it's a trump card you're playing there.
When we were living...
That's way below the belt.
When we were living together in Oxford, Michael's father published this really fascinating, sort of iconoclastic book, Beyond Survival. Thank goodness he didn't copyright the word beyond, because then I would have been in trouble. But I just want to read one short sentence from near the end. He writes as follows. While the Israelites were still Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, Moses and Aaron were already legislating, giving seemingly trivial instructions for what was to happen in the promised land. For they knew that the future had already started. It is still with us, and only by taking one step at a time can we inherit it. And I think to read that, particularly now in the darkness of this time, and to ask you, if the future is with us, where do you draw strength to take those steps forward?
The story to which you refer should perhaps be recounted, since you've hinted at it. First, was absolutely true. I stepped back from the lexicon I'd written. You should know that for the years I was writing the book, it was a little bit, if any of you have ever engaged in fantasy sports, this doesn't look like the crowd, but anyway, what you do in fantasy sports is you make up virtual teams based on who you think is going to do well. And you're constantly swapping in one player for another. That's how I was writing my book. I've done another chapter on Jewish obligation, but isn't that covered in the one before? And then what am I going to say about this one? And I noticed, not with surprise, but it came through very clearly, that there isn't a chapter to be found in here about anti-Semitism or about the Holocaust. And it can't be because I'm not aware of the reality of either of those, but because, and I knew this, I think, from the beginning, and it just was echoed in how the book played out in the writing, that I'm simply never been prepared to accord to them a kind of generative power. Taub, Marmur, my late father, writes this book called Beyond Survival, in which he plays with the very evocative notion coined by a friend of his and a former employer of mine, Professor Emil Fackenheim, who talked about the 614th commandment. After the Taryag, the 613th, the 614th being not to give Hitler a posthumous victory and to survive, etc., etc. And my father writes his book called Beyond Survival, trying to say the problem that he noticed in Jewish life as it's being lived out around him is that people make the imperative to survive into a kind of Sinai moment, and that such a Judaism can't prevail, shouldn't prevail. And my book, in a sense, is a footnote to that idea, by me not being prepared to give constitutive power to these things. That said, I do tell a story at the end, which is a true story. I always try to put one true story in. It's a rule. And the story is that my mother, who's still with us, she's 90 years old, very handy, very able with sewing and such. And at one point, my wife, Sarah, asked her many years ago if she would embroider a talit for her, for Sarah. And my mother became very moved by this question and then explained why. That she then recalled, the question triggered with her in her memory, that in Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was the last 6 months of her war, one of the rules in the camp was that the women, it was a women's camp, could not wear underwear except for repurposed talitot. Such was the perversity of the camp that that's what one was allowed to wear. And that she found the invitation to create a new, as a sort of a tikkun for herself. And at the end of my book, I tell the story and try to say that is, I think it's possible to draw some hope and some strength and some animation from a kind of defiance that is not mired in rage, but from a kind of a creative urge and a wish to pass something on to the coming generation. To this day, I mean, my opinions have not, one of the things we talk about from time to time is how everybody during these years, since October 7th and before, proclaims how everybody's opinions have changed radically. But when you talk to them, typically what they mean is, your opinions must have changed radically since October the 7th. I'm as right as ever I was. So what the point of that is to say, this period we're living in also involves not just a weaponizing of narrative, but certainly of anti-Semitism and of the specter of the Holocaust and all the rest of it. I want to acknowledge a weak spot in myself, that I'm so keen not to give it a constitutive power that I sometimes refuse to acknowledge that its presence or its existence. I have to be self-aware enough to say that. So the last sentence I'll say before I give you back a ping pong for your last question is to say that I have always found the most giddying, the most exciting, the most attractive aspect of this privilege of being part of Jewish life is this creative possibility. I use in the preface, in the introduction to the book, the model of the Masoretes, those who tell us how we should pronounce the words. And I try to say that this is a great privilege of being in every generation of Jewish life. The words come down to us. I did not write the Torah, but I, as you, have the responsibility of deciding how I'm going to pronounce it. I have a question for you that speaks also to our troubled times and speaks to something you've been very involved in your diplomatic career and aspects of your life. I can't think of a time that's anything like the current time, particularly when one travels out in the world, where people of one generation talk about the impossibility of communicating. When this question started, there were 10 minutes to go, and now there are only 5 minutes to go. That tells you I've been speaking too long. But they speak about the impossibility of having effective communication between generations, particularly on issues relating to Israel, the war, Zionism, and all the rest of it. This is one of those places where these theories are really tested in the white heat of the contemporary situation. What kind of insights can you offer? What do you think we do faced with this impossibility of discourse?
Well, thank you. This is going to be a brief answer because I do want to leave time for questions, and I know but it's true that I think it's become very rare that I speak to a Jewish audience abroad, and at the end of the session, I'm not taken aside by at least one set of parents who ask me, what do we do with our kids? They're demonstrating for the other side. We can't speak to them and so on. And the first thing is I have to be very cautious and very humble before saying anything. You know, families are complicated. Often the issue that really troubles you isn't the issue that you say is the issue that troubles you and so on. But having said that, there are some tentative suggestions that I do make. The first one is simply to take the conversation offline. It is surprising how often these conversations take place at the full family Seder table or in the extended family WhatsApp group, and that is probably not the most productive place to have them. you want to try and find the environment where the reputational costs of listening, of moderating your opinion are going to be low. The second thing that I would offer as a suggestion is something that comes from Adal Cohen, who is a conflict resolution expert at Hebrew University. And he suggests starting difficult conversations with something called the GEM statement. The GEM statement is really a statement of the core value that holds you together. And, to say we're the only family that each other has, or we know we both care about this. And he says you should think about what your GEM statement is, and then you should say it explicitly. And that's not easy, but if you're not able to say it explicitly, maybe you're not ready to have that conversation. The third thing I would say, and this takes us back maybe to a question before, I think it can sometimes be helpful to start not with talking points, but with stories. And the story of what shaped your opinion. I could imagine a situation where a member of a younger generation might hear from a member of an older generation of the family what it's like to grow up in a household where there is always a packed suitcase under one of the beds. And an older member might learn from a younger member what it's like to share a college dorm with a Lebanese or Palestinian student who is on the phone home worried every night. And it may well be that before we try to change each other's minds, we can start just by trying to open their hearts. And I'll make one other small suggestion. Even where we are spending a lot of time on opposite sides of the table, we should find a way to spend a little time on the same side of the table. I spent some time studying at the Kennedy School, and funnily enough, sitting next to me in class was an older student called Jamal Muhad, who had been president of Ecuador. And he actually had negotiated the peace treaty between Ecuador and Peru, which was a very long-lasting conflict. And he told me that before going into his first negotiating meeting with President Fujimori of Peru, he had called up Roger Fisher, the famous negotiation expert at Harvard, to ask for his advice, what they should do. And he said, there is only one thing that you should try and get out of your first meeting. And that is a photograph of the two of you sitting not across the table, but on the same side of the table, looking at a map together, to send the message that you're engaged in a problem-solving exercise. And as far apart as we are, somewhere in the Middle East, there is going to be a non-profit or an initiative that speaks to the values of both of us. And we should make that our joint project. The Democratic commentator, Van Jones, writes that when he was a youngster, he had a surprising friendship, political friendship, with Newt Gingrich. And he said it was Newt that taught him that your 90% enemy can be your 10% friend. And so if we can just spend a little bit of time.
But with tariffs, that doesn't work, that's the problem.
But if we can spend a little time in that 10%, it may be just a little reminder of what the rest of our relationship could be like.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both so much for this poignant, inspiring, and important conversation, and for letting us listen in on this intimate chavruta. At this time, I'm going to ask one of you to share the microphone so that we can facilitate a few questions from the audience, and we'll give both of you a final word at the conclusion to wrap up any questions. At this time, if you'd like to just indicate that you'd like the mic. Right in this second row. You can say your name.
Judith Margolis, thank you so much. I appreciate it. This was extremely helpful. I always look for practical applications to philosophical questions. I'm engaged. I feel like I took from you, we're individually in families, and then we're in communities, and then we're in professional lives, et cetera. And I've had people, professional people who I was colleagues with for years, literally, these are people with a PhD from Harvard, say, you are a colonizing, baby-killing, genocidal. They're saying that to me personally, because I live here and because whatever. And I haven't known how to have our conversations or even continue a correspondence. I ended up signing up for a mediation course with David Hoffman in Boston. I don't know if you're familiar with him. How am I going to talk to people when I want to rip their throats out and I'm not supposed to be that kind of a person? So I feel like you've really, really, really given me some possibilities of what to do, and I am very, very, very grateful. So I guess the question I was going to say is whether it's the person who might hire you for a job or publish your piece or your family member, right? Which this is it's not a joke. Which do you think is more difficult to have the conversation?
Let's take a couple more in continuum and then give an opportunity to respond altogether.
Hi, Daniel. And this is a question to Daniel. Wonderful phrase you said, I can change your mind. You can change my mind, but you can't change my instructions. I find that is often describes a conversation I have with someone who has a faith religious background, and I get into a conversation with them and I'm waiting for them to say why they disagree with me, and it's because that's what God said. I'm paraphrasing many other ways of saying the same thing. How does one deal with that type of statement where you're having a reasoned argument and they're saying, well, God just doesn't agree with you and I'm with God?
Hi, Tamara is my name. This is also a question for Daniel. In Talmud, there are 3 characters that appear frequently when in an argument there's trouble or a rabbi needs to be shaken and think things in another way. And it's the ger, the isha, and the tinok, right? The convert, but I don't think they always mean the convert, the woman and the child. So in terms of disputes and arguments, what are the 3 voices that are missing to like challenge the argument that is already happening?
We'll take one more question and then offer both opportunities to reflect.
My name is Jonathan. Question to either of you or both of you. I'm curious to hear your views on intolerance. In the more liberal circles, if I can use that word roughly to describe both of you, I think we're very good at pluralism and we're very good at tolerance. And I think we've suffered greatly because we're not very good at intolerance. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you all.
So first of all, thank you so much for those great questions. So was it Tamara? So the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned that was how interesting it is that all 3 of the categories that you mentioned, there are fascinating passages in the Talmud where the rabbis are beaten by a ger, by a convert. And some of the greatest scholars, of course, were converts, but by women. Bruria, Rabbi Yehuda Nassi's maidservant, defeated everybody. And there's some fascinating stories where children actually out-logic rabbis and so on. You're absolutely right, that's not the main story. But I think for a text that is a millennia and a half old in that time, to offer us those little hooks that we can hold on to and nurture and expand. And thank goodness today, what we are seeing is an explosion, particularly of women-led knowledge that is adding something extraordinary to the Jewish corpus. I think Danny, I should just pay tribute to the fact that he has known each of us nearly as long as we've known each other. And what do you do with somebody who is taking instructions from on high? And it may well be that it's one of the conversations where you can't make any progress at all. But the thing that I would suggest that you do is to see whether, for all of that, you can move the conversation to an area where there is the potential for growth. You know, I tell the story of a Soviet-American arms negotiation where they were making no progress whatsoever, and the American was very frustrated. And at one point, the Soviet negotiator said to him, "You know what your trouble is? You keep asking me questions that I have the answer to. Why don't you ask me questions that I don't have the answer to?" So, you know, I would think about, is there something in the personal experience, in the broader range of things where I can maybe get some value out of this conversation? I think it's rare that there won't be anything at all. And thank you so much. You know, sadly, a PhD from Harvard doesn't count for as much today as it used to. There are some techniques, and I do mention some more in the book, but I don't want to say that. I want to say something else. One of the things that I find helpful when you can't speak to somebody at all is not to say, "I can't speak to him or her," but to say, "I can't speak to them today." I think there's a really beautiful idea. Jonathan Sachs calls it the chronological imagination. And it's our ability to argue across generations. I find it incredibly moving when I walk into the National Library and I see, for example, the books of the Vilna Gaon next to the books of the leaders of Hasidut, when in their own days they would be burning each other. Or you could say the same thing about, I don't know, the different kibbutz movements in the early years of the state that were at each other's throats. And if you happen to meet two old timers, they hug each other, because who remembers what those things are about? So I think holding out the possibility, I mean, in my family, you know, my grandmother's family had many siblings. One of them was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, and another became a communist member of parliament, you know, eating a ham sandwich outside the shul on Yom Kippur and the works. And yet in his later years, after watching what had happened in the Soviet Union, he would come to my parents' house for meals, hungry to hear a little bit of Yiddish. And I think having that chronological imagination helps put those very painful, you know, I tell my kids, our job is to heal the Broiguses of yesterday and to create the new Broiguses of tomorrow. And so I think that chronological imagination can be a little bit helpful.
That's a good, you should certainly patent that one. Before I take on the question that I was asked, I will steal one of the questions that was directed towards you. You know, we're going to read the story of the Akedah, and we are usually the same people, perhaps, Daniel, who say to you, "Well, God told me," would adduce from that story exactly what it means to be a person of faith. God speaks to you against your self-interest in the most blinding way, and if you are indeed a knight of faith, as Kierkegaard would have had it, then what you do is obey. And if you get in between me and my God in that regard, then don't expect any sympathy from me. I take some solace from the thought that that is not the way that our tradition has actually read even that story. I'm always in mind of the Midrash at this time of year as the story is read, the Midrash which says God couldn't understand why Abraham decided to sacrifice his son. After all, what I said to him was, Ha'alehu sham le'olah, take him up there. I was telling you to take him up the mountain. Why did you, how could you possibly have thought that what I, God, would have wanted you to do would be such a dreadful thing? Now, again, this is the Midrashic imagination on speed, if you like, but it is a source of some solace. A person who tells you, as they increasingly will, that God has instructed them one way or the other, there are tools within our tradition which can give you some way of grappling even with that statement. I was asked a question about the intolerance of the liberals. And here I will relate to something that you just said. I feel less able to grapple with this question today than I might do another day. I say so because today, a delegation from the organization that I'm very involved with, Rabbis for Human Rights, went out, as we do during this season of the harvest, to Samaria, as in the Begin Center, I should certainly call it. And some settler youths who came down and fired shots in the air. And one of my colleagues, Rabbi Dana Sharon, had to get some, she wasn't shot, but she was injured along the way. Some days, bemoaning the illiberal nature of the liberals feels less possible than others, okay? But having said that, you are, of course, absolutely right. In my experience, whether or not you are doctrinaire has little to do with whether you identify on one side of a theological spectrum or the other. There is nothing so there's no one so intransigent as a Reformed Jew when it comes to changing one or other custom to which they have become accustomed. It's more to do with your personality, whether you have a greater tolerance, to use that word, for change and possibility, and not so much the question of what team you're playing for. My first letter in my alphabet, letter Aleph, is represented by the word aspaklaria. Aspaklaria, fascinating Hebrew word that comes to Hebrew from Latin and Greek, which refers to a kind of kaleidoscopic way of perceiving and looking at the world outside. Too often, folks who define themselves as progressives don't actually have much of a sensitivity to the multiple possibilities, different perspectives. I'll give you one more thing that I say in the book. Every morning when I get up in the morning and say, Modeh ani lefanecha, I give thanks to you, I think about that Hebrew expression, Modeh ani, I give thanks lefanecha, to the multifaceted aspects, both of God's reality and of this complicated reality we're all living through. So I'll underline your question. We liberals are as illiberal as all the rest, but some days it's harder to admit that than others.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. Final one word, last word for the evening from each of you.
You should have the very last word. So I will just thank you all for coming out and being part of this, and thank Daniel in this completely natural and unstaged kind of a way, because it really is a great privilege. I'm sure each of us in our own ways have reason to reflect as life goes on how precious friendship is, and how commodity it is to be cherished. And when it turns out that your friends are as creative and talented and brilliant as you always thought they might be, it's a really great source of comfort and of hope. And I hope that these books and lots of other examples of creativity continue to give life to this ever-dying enterprise.
So it's more than mutual, and if I think of the ways in which Michael has opened my mind over the years, he's been a deep gift to me. Maybe just one final thought. You know, one of the things that strikes me about the power of a good argument, the power of a good conversation, is how subversive it is. You know, it's something that in a society where we may have genuine complaints about the government and the media and all other institutions, nobody can take away from us that simple ability to reach out to somebody else and have a conversation where we are flying without a net that might take us to somewhere where we never knew we would go. And so that's something that I think also we can draw strength from. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much once again to Ambassador Taub and Rabbi Marmur. I want to close as you opened, that may it be that all of us can, by arguing, create more and more friendships and bridge divides. Thank you so much. Final word.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you, Michael Marmur and Daniel Taub again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Pardes and for the president of Pardes, Rabbi Leon Morris, who's here with us as well. And I hope to see you all again very soon. Good night. Oh, and books on sale outside. Daniel's book is on sale. Michael's is not there, but there's a QR code that you can scan and get to his book that way. It's outside, stuck there. Bye.